Okay, I'm going to record some strategies for how to write up the results of a qualitative article. So I decided to break this into two different videos, one qualitative, one quantitative. This will be the qualitative piece. So hopefully we can look at what we need to include in the results section of your manuscript. And I'm going to go through some examples on how to synthesize and sort of come up with a way to write your qualitative results based on some examples. So, no matter what kind of article we're writing, the purpose of the results is to report your analysis. Okay. And so, with qualitative, uh, it's not uncommon for students or for even anybody, because there are so many words that we sometimes lose sight of our research question. And so we want to make sure that our analysis is our words, our interviews, our data are analyzed through the lens of our research question. So I always have that research question in the back of my head, right? What are the perspectives of OT practitioners who treat individuals living with Parkinson's? Okay, and so perspectives, maybe in my framework, I've identified what are some of those practice perspectives, which maybe influence the questions I asked for my interviews. Okay, and so that should help you frame, okay, what am I going to report or how am I going to analyze this? A lot of qualitative analysis that you do, that hopefully you're working on now, is how to sort of break down the qualitative interviews, and then you're restructuring them to come up with meaningful themes. And so some research preceptors do more of that thematic analysis. It's very general, where you're coding to break it down, you're lumping them into categories to sort of organize them. And then from there, you're forming meaningful thematic statements, okay, that represent what your population that you interviewed or that you're studying, what their thoughts, what their perspectives were. Okay, so hold true to your research question on that. Your pre or your results section when it comes to qualitative is likely going to be the longest session, okay, or section, because you're really telling those stories. You're using direct quotations from your interviews, your transcripts, that really justifies those theme statements. So in qualitative research, we really need to convince the reader that those themes you came up with are true, are valid, are legit. And we do so by using those direct quotes to substantiate those claims that we made as qualitative researchers. Okay, so that's going to be very, very, very long for you. Again, I'm going to skip over the quantitative parts and just focus more on qualitative. Okay, I've already said it's going to be very long. Um, Make sure you're reviewing your APA 7th edition, because if you're using quotes that are greater than 40 words, you actually use your block quotations for those. Okay, so take a look at that APA manual. You might have to word for word count how many words are in those quotes. It's also very helpful to display your data analysis in a figure, okay? Because this helps the reader logically look at your results, okay, and look at your analysis and say, okay, here are the code words on the left-hand side. I can see now how they were organized into categories. Those code words, yep, that makes logical sense that those code words would fall under that category. And then perhaps you have a couple categories that interplay between the two and form a thematic statement. And so that figure is basically proof or documentation that should help that reader believe without a doubt that your analysis logically led to those thematic statements. Okay? So again, it's helpful for you to produce that. Remember this summer, we did a class project where we actually did some coding, categories, and thematic statements, and we wrote those up in a figure. So you should have an example of that. Please refer to that. Here's an example of a figure. Now, figure and data analysis on the very bottom should not be centered, but I did take this from a publication, and that's what the journal editor decided to do. So, again, that's not an APA format. But you can see here my long list of code words on the left-hand side. Okay. And so those condensed into those categories or a descriptor, okay, that really organized those different categories, okay, or codes. So in this particular analysis, I interviewed caregivers of children who've experienced trauma. It ended up being a lot of foster parents, okay, and so when interviewing them, okay, I would ask them questions and then I coded all of those transcripts. So I had trial and error, structure, routine, quiet time, communication, patience, avoiding conflict. So what did all of those code words, what did they all have in common based on what our participants were talking about? And so really, when I looked at that, they really were falling under the category of routine. So these caregivers were talking about the importance of structuring their time throughout their day. Okay. They were reporting that they needed to trial and error things to see what worked, what didn't work. Oh, this did not work. This was horrible. Okay, but this was starting to work. Structuring that routine and making sure nothing was unpredictable. Having clear communication about the routine so that child knew what to expect, having patience when things didn't go well, and then looking at their routine and thinking, how can we avoid conflict, right? Like how can we they talked a lot about picking their battles, right? And so did they want something to be a battle or were they just going to avoid the conflict? And so all of those code words logically tied to routine. Okay. You can kind of take a look at the other examples. Behaviors, morning time, bedtime, routine. And again, routine, you can use some of your code words more than once. Dressing, clothing, textures, perseverating, sensory. And so, what did all of those things have to do? Well, they were all revolving around sensory processing issues. Okay. Um, in this particular data analysis, the categories didn't necessarily overlap or form relationships that I could talk about with their thematic statements. So I wrote a thematic statement for each one. Um, and so you can kind of see the start of my thematic statement starts with like what did every caregiver say? And so these thematic statements are kind of general because they need to encompass most or all of what everybody said. And that remember that's we want those voices to be heard. And so you can see here I started every thematic statement with every caregiver voiced or every caregiver reported. Okay, there's one in here where several caregivers reported. Okay. So every caregiver voiced the importance of providing structure and routine to their children's daily life in order to prevent challenging behaviors. Okay. So when we go back and we look at trial and error, structure, routine, all of those things, right? Conflict, um, and we break that down into routine. So, what is it that they were saying was important? Okay, and that was part of my analysis. And so every caregiver talked about the importance of providing structure and routine to prevent those challenging behaviors or to prevent conflict. Okay. The next one, sensory processing. So not every single caregiver said, hey, sensory processing, but most of them talked about sensory aversion. So that tactile defensiveness, right? Issues and struggling with clothing, fighting that bedtime routine like crazy, being super crabby in the morning, all of those things. And so several caregivers voiced sensory aversions that occurred on a daily basis that affected the child's ability to complete daily routines. So they were having crazy meltdowns. Okay. Um, so anyway, those are some examples of how I analyze the data. Clearly, you have to know your transcripts well, and play around with some of these code words. And don't forget what we did this summer. So this is a very busy slide, but what I wanted to show you is when writing your narrative or writing the results section based on your analysis, you can kind of follow a little recipe, which really helped me. Okay, so in the narrative, you're going to start off by introducing your themes. You might be very general about them based on what was in your figure. Okay. But then after that generalization, then you're going to go into great detail about each theme, and it might be helpful if you separate that with a different heading. It might be a level 2 heading, it might be a level 3 heading. Okay? So I'm going to start writing my qualitative results by saying the four themes that emerged from the qualitative data analysis are as follows. And then here are some condensed summaries, right, of those themes that we saw in my figure. Following that introductory paragraph, okay, then we start off with focusing on the first theme, which I came up with the heading, structure and routine, because that's really what that theme is revolving around. Okay. Um, Caregivers identifying a significant need for structure and that daily routine. And so I put structure and routine. Okay. And I'm starting off broad. Okay. All participants identified having specific morning, evening, and bedtime routines for their children. Okay. They all really did describe that. Caregivers reported that a predictable routine assisted their children to be successful with their daily activities. Okay, so I'm sort of um, I'm sort of gently introducing what the meaning of this theme is. Then I'm going to set it up. One caregiver described limiting noise and distractions prior to bedtime in order to dot, dot, dot. Okay, so when I'm saying one caregiver described limiting noise and distraction prior to bedtime, okay, that's introducing what that quotation that I'm pulling from that transcript, what that's going to say. Okay. So once you describe and explain and introduce what your quote is about to state, so you're giving it some context, okay, um, that's when, again, that introductory thing, one caregiver described, okay, what is it that they described? And then we'll add that direct quote. So you have to help the reader understand, you have to basically help the reader understand the point of that quote. Okay, you don't want to make them work. You don't want to make them interpret themselves. And so for me, when I was writing qualitative, it seemed like, oh my gosh, what this seems so like I'm putting words in my participant's mouth. Why can't I just put the quote? Well, no, it's super helpful for the reader to understand your analysis. Okay, and this is what you think the client is trying to say, or your participant is trying to say, and then you're introducing that quote. That quotation should justify your theme, which should answer or relate to your research question. So again, what are the perspectives of care or what are the parenting perspectives of children who've experienced trauma? Okay. And so structure and routine. So having something that is predictable, right, and structured really helped their parenting. And so that really helped answer my research question. They build on each other to tell a story, and so typically this section, right, it's going to be quite long because uh, if we look at how much is in the theme, caregivers identified a significant need for structure in a child's daily routine. Okay, and so then I'm setting the first quotation up. One caregiver described limiting noise and distraction prior to bedtime in order to, and it's probably going to say something about preventing some kind of challenging behavior. Okay. Um, and then I might say, additionally, caregivers also reported that having structure did XYZ to their daily routine. Okay. One participant shared, and I specifically remember this one. They just needed to get the child removed from the home because they were, um, or in the morning routine, they just needed to take that child away from the other kids in the home because they were being so disruptive. And so what worked for them was they actually, when one of the parents went to work early in the morning, they took that child with and sort of had them focus on their own routine. That way they weren't involved with the other kids' routine. So after you set up the quote, you tell the reader what that quote is going to say, you use that quote, and then you summarize how that relates to your research question. Now, some options for qualitative research, you actually will say this quotation is similar, or this instance of this caregiver's report is similar to the literature with um, Green et al. Reporting blah, 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 blah. And so some qualitative research will have data or will have additional literature in their results section, whereas some don't. Some wait until the discussion piece. So this is sort of a continuation of, okay, we're setting this up. Um, One caregiver reported that structured and routine assisted their children to be successful with their daily activities. One caregiver described limiting noise and distractions prior to bedtime in order to aid in the transition. Okay. The caregiver of a 10-year-old child, again, just giving context, stated, he does quiet time, which is actually lying down, and he falls asleep almost every time. If he doesn't, and again, this is me providing more context to this quote by putting it in parentheses to help the reader. If he doesn't engage in quiet time, he is like a 2-year-old. Okay. So then another caregiver reinforced the importance of following a routine by stating, once we hit a certain point in the night, it's always the same routine. Okay. And then routines are particularly important for children who've experienced trauma because they need environments that are predictable and safe. And that was from Cole et al. So in this particular example, right, I had pulled some of that literature right there in the theme. And sometimes you don't. Sometimes you wait until you're in the discussion part. Um, let's see here. So kind of going back to you're setting up the quote, you state the quote, and then you summarize the quote. Okay, and possibly introduce another aspect or another example that you found in your transcript that reinforces that theme. Okay, so another example. This one was funny. This example was funny because the editor of the journal said, "Well, we want to know exactly how many of your participants stated this." Right? And so that's very not qualitative. Qualitative's like every participant, most participants. And this particular editor was like, you need to tell us exactly how many. So, seven of the participants shared they had never traveled outside the country before with their international service learning experience, and four shared that they were anxious about their safety prior to the trip. The following describes how one participant felt prior to the experience. Okay, so again, I'm trying to set this up into we're looking at travel, like a new experience. We're looking at traveling. Um, some of those were even saying they were anxious about it. Okay, and then I'm adding how did they feel? One participant or describes how they felt before the experience. Quote, I was so worried about our safety and how safe it was going to be. Okay. Another participant added, you have to be careful when traveling internationally, and you just never know what could happen anywhere. I mean, that's with going anywhere traveling. So you always have that in the back of your mind as far as safety. Okay, so those are two quotations that I use to justify, okay, how those students were feeling that had never traveled outside the country before. Some of them were really anxious and really targeted safety. Okay, so again, I have to introduce that theme. I introduce that what that quote is going to say, and then I follow it up with a quote. So more discussion to come later. Again, with qualitative, you might be just saving your discussion and adding a summary of those themes and then how it relates to literature. Is it similar to what was already found? Okay, is it different? Also, in your discussion, you're going to talk about your implications to practice. Okay, so if you're writing something on um, parenting children who've experienced trauma, what's the implications to OT for that? Like, what did you find? What were those results? What did you discuss? And then how can OT help? Or what's that implications to OT practice? For international service learning, what's the implications to OT education, right? And so, what did we learn in our study that can inform those people who work with those OT students? Okay, so you're going to also compare contrast to the literature. So again, you're going to talk about each of those themes in your discussion, and you're going to discuss how they're similar, how they're different than what was found in the literature. Okay, with every discussion, you're going to talk about your limitations of your study, and then talk about, well, what are you going to recommend for future research? Okay, so maybe with a qualitative analysis, maybe after you interview caregivers of children who've experienced trauma, maybe you're saying, okay, well, we want to focus on, or another logical step to our research would be, um, what are the perspectives of parents who receive outpatient OT for their children who've experienced trauma? Okay, or something along those lines. Okay, there should be a very logical next step for another area of research. It's also helpful if you look at a results section of a well done article. Okay, and so what did the author say in that first introductory paragraph after results? Okay, again, typically it's usually a summary of all of the different themes that they found, and then they might go into theme one. Okay, and then start introducing that. Really look at how that author introduces, like what are they saying in the first sentence, the second sentence. Um, then they insert the quotation, and then do they have a summary afterwards, or do they just go into another quotation? Okay, and so looking and reading articles and looking at the results section and sort of identifying what is the point the author's trying to make here, how did they make it, and then how can I make that point? How can I introduce my quotation in order to justify my theme? So I hope that helps. I know it's a lot of information, a lot of words. It's qualitative, right? But if you look at sort of the recipe of how you summarize, set it up and introduce the quote, add the quote, right? Continue on with the quote or with another quote, and how they relate specifically to your themes. That hopefully will help you figure out how to write that section. Any questions, any suggestions, anything, come and see me. I'm more than willing to help. Thank you so much.